further away from our army.
Some brand it the most crucial EU summit since the financial crisis of 2008, a last chance to stave off bankruptcy for a Ukraine government that might run out of money by the end of spring, and to stare down increased hybrid attacks from Russia, Denmark flagging one this very Thursday. But with Vladimir Putin insisting that it's not European swine that will stop Russia from liberating its, quote, historic lands, and that the U.S. actively supporting pro-Moscow parties that continue to surge in polling across the continent, leaders of the 27-member bloc must now pick their druthers. Seize 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets for Ukraine and run the risk of legal liability down the road, borrow on the bond market, which Germany and other fiscally frugal Northern Europeans reject out of hand, or cave, as a small but vocal minority of leaders inside the bloc would prefer. Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about decision time in Brussels. With us, Anastasia Shapachkina, president of the Eastern Circle's think tank, lecturer in geopolitics at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
With us as well, André Lozikog-Petri, president of the Joint European Disruptive Initiative. Remind our viewers, what is JEDI?
Well, we fund and we launch the technology bricks that would help Europe to be competitive again. So we are the Advanced Research Agency of Europe.
All right, and that's something that probably Elon Musk, who wants to do away with the EU, would not like to hear. Eleanor Beardsley, Paris correspondent for a National Public Radio. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Francois.
And from Washington, Robert Peters, Senior Research Fellow for Strategic Deterrence at the Heritage Foundation think tank's Allison Center for National Security. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
On the go, by the way, you can listen to the France 24 debate wherever podcasts are streamed. The U.S. may be pushing diplomacy, but compromise not a word on Vladimir Putin's lips at an annual defense ministry meeting in Moscow on Wednesday.
Everyone expected they would destroy Russia in a short period of time, tear it apart. The little European pigs immediately joined the efforts of the previous US administration, seeking to profit from the collapse of our country, to reclaim what had been lost in previous historical periods, to take revenge. As it has become obvious to everyone, all these attempts and destructive plans against Russia have failed, completely failed.
Talking about little European pigs, André Lozikog-Petri, is this just noise, or should EU leaders pay attention?
Well, I think we rather pay attention, and it's already a long time that we should pay attention. I mean, we hear this discourse of Putin, but we should also hear the discourse of the head of MI6, of the French chief of the army, General Mandon. And we are really seeing that the time, I mean, the cards are off, the gloves are off, and we really have, we are basically at conflict with Russia. So I think that either Europe stays, and we're going to talk about these frozen assets, in a legalistic way, or we just take reality into account that our future is at stake and we should not hesitate.
All right, Putin said more, by the way. He said Russia's open to resuming diplomacy with the continent, quote, if not with the current politicians, then when the political elites of Europe are replaced. Over in the United States, they recently published a new national security strategy paper last month. It talked up competition with China, more focus on the Americas, and a pulling away from a Europe that faced, quote, civilizational erasure. The Trump administration, since pushing back against a report in the defense industry news outlet Defense One, which reports that, that it got a fuller version of that strategic paper in its hands. In it, it says Austria, Hungary, Italy, and Poland are listed as countries the U.S. should, quote, work more with the goal of pulling them away from the European Union. Robert Peters, do you think that reporting is accurate? And if so, should Europe see the U.S. as an adversary?
I mean, I haven't seen the supposedly full report that Defense One has. They haven't published that report. So, I mean, people can make their own determination as to the validity of that report. What I would say is that, should Europe be pulling away from the United States, I don't think that's in Europe's interest. The United States has been a stalwart ally of Europe for over 80 years at this point. And, our commitments remain strong given the number of Americans that are deployed in defense of Europe, as well as America's nuclear guarantee that remains strong to this day. So I think there's a lot of hyperventilating that we should try to get under control.
38 military bases still on this continent of the United States. You're correct to point out the commitment of the U.S. But when you read that paper, did you think to yourself that this could be a turning point?
Well, I mean, what the paper makes clear is that China is the United States' primary adversary. They pose a far greater threat to global stability and peace than does Russia. Now, that's not to say that Russia is not a threat. It is a threat. But the United States looks across the board and says there is no NATO analog in East Asia and the Western Pacific, and therefore we have to do more to deter a peer competitor in the form of China. And Europe is more than capable of deterring, and if necessary, defeating Russian aggression should it come to that. And I think that paper is simply a reality, a reflection of that reality.
Europe can fend for itself, Anastasia Shepachkina?
Europe still depends on a whole range of American strategic weapons, which it doesn't have enough of. One of the weapons it doesn't have enough of is air defense, especially after donations to Ukraine, of course, and with continuing donations to Ukraine as well, which is extremely important and it is a contribution to European defense. However, it's the U.S. weapons that we see donated by the U.S. and by the Europeans, sold by the U.S. and by the Europeans now. And we don't see enough production of air defense, for example, by European companies for Europe and for Ukraine on their own. This is just one example. You can go further. You can go toward the airlift, which is also strategic airlift. Europe does not have that capacity. You can go to communication. Starlink is a technology which has proven itself on the front line, very difficult to replace, and there are attempts to replace it. Also, there are European projects which have been in the works, but have not yet produced the scalable and the commercially viable solution, which can be now used for the European defense, for Ukrainian defense. Hence, we are living in a time when the U.S. is turning from a European ally to what looks increasingly as a Russian ally with shared values, shared political regime, kind of orientation of where the U.S. wants to go. And
is that you're just back from Ukraine? Is that how Ukrainians see it? That they put kind of the U.S. and Russia in the same bag?
What the Ukrainians see, and I don't want to speak for them, of course. The Ukrainians must position themselves between the rock and the hard place and try to work with the U.S. as it is. And they are working with the U.S. as is. However, they understand that they haven't seen any money whatsoever dedicated to Ukraine since the beginning of the year, since the inauguration of Donald Trump. Anything that has continued coming to Ukraine is the money which Biden committed. But nothing new is committed. And that gap, which is in tens of billions of euros, Europe, unfortunately, is unable to close. And this is why today the council members are meeting about the Russian assets. And the Russian assets is going to, if, let's say, they decide to go for it and to somehow either loan money to Ukraine with Russian assets as collateral or whatever solution they're going to find, this is going to be enough money for 2 years. And without this money, and then another solution will have to be found. So we're looking into long-term strategy, where Europe is finding itself alone, while Russia is having one ally more.
All right, and just before we go dive deep into the issue of how to come up with that money, as you framed so correctly, I just want to emphasize how a good night's sleep is so important if you're trying to come up with policy. Just look at Eleanor Beardsley's phone. We can show you a screenshot of hers, courtesy of your social media account reporting of your last assignment to Ukraine. Yeah, 10:38 p.m. error alert, 10:25 p.m. error alert. Now, of course, if you're in Kyiv, life does go on as normal. Nice hat, Eleanor. I appreciate it. It's really nice. But the routine includes nightly attacks. We can show you one from an apartment block in the capital. Eleanor, tell us about this particular one.
It was just, there was like 7 places hit around the city. Several people had died and many injured, and we just went to one of them, and all the neighbors were out cleaning up, and there was a whole line of people getting plywood cut for windows that had been blown out. That apartment was completely destroyed. And we interviewed people, and they were sweeping. They're like, they won't break us. We're out. We're picking up. It's just so bizarre to go out in a city, and you've heard the sirens, you're sleeping and your phone just starts blaring and then it's blaring outside and you have to decide, well, do I go down in the safe room or do I try to sleep? And another person in our house is texting me, it's ballistic missiles tonight. And it's just so surreal. And they're just living like this now, coming up on 4 years. So it's, I've been traveling to Ukraine now since 2014. And to see the switch in the U.S. stance is just, it's hard to know what to say, but the Ukrainians are so lucid. I think when there was that blow up in the Oval Office in, was it February with Zelensky, that really just horrified people, freaked them out totally. But now they're used to it and they know, and they don't think that the U.S. will come back on board. And so they see, but exactly as Anastasia was saying, Zelensky is in such a tight place. He has to be still the ally of the U.S. He cannot, disparage President Trump. He has to play ball. The pressure he must be under, I can't even imagine. But what's happening right now is like the U.S. is selling Ukraine. So for a business deal, we're going to just sell them to the Russians. That's what it feels like. And the Ukrainians know that, but they will not be bought. They do not want to give away the territory they have fought for.
André Leduc-Petrie?
Well, I had the same experience end of September, where indeed we went. I mean, there was nightlife going on until midnight, and then at 2 you had the first alarm. Then at 3:30 you had the first alarm. So it was all the foreigners who went down to the safe rooms at 5:30.
What, the locals stayed in their beds?
Well, many locals are fatalist, and on the other side they have such a resistance morale, which is impressive. But you can only imagine the damage that it's doing to a population that since 3.5 years now, and think about the children that are experiencing that night and day. So I think the psychological damage is huge, but they're clearly not breaking. At the contrary, what breaks their heart, I think, is to see some allies either retreating or some hesitating. And I must say, even the Europeans now need to show. I mean, I just hope that these legalistic aspects that drive us in a whole, also on technology topics, which is a bit more my topic, will finally be overcome and Europe shows resolve. And by the way, to come back to what our colleague of Heritage said on the national security strategy, what I feel, and you don't hear that so much in Europe, is that actually China, which is the #1 rival of the US, is seen as a respected rival. And I think the paragraph on Europe is just a feeling in Washington and some circles in the US, and I must say I have a little bit of sympathy for that, is that Europeans are not necessarily always, they do it with money, but they are not necessarily at the height of where they should be in terms of history. They need to show much more resolve on defense, on weapon system, and the fact that exactly at the same time we will probably experience the end of the French-German project on a joint fighter, I mean, shows you the contradiction, the schizophrenia of the Europeans. On one side, you hear, yes, we need to be on our own, and on the other side, you see some countries who are barking at doing even 2% defense spending. So I think this nudge from the US, as inconvenient it is, may hopefully help us to grow up.
And you heard Anastasia Shapachkina state that with financing starting to run dry, this summit is also crucial. It brings us to those frozen Russian assets that most EU leaders have been eyeing. Earlier, there was a sit-down between the man who needs the money and the man who has the lion's share of it, or sitting on it. Ukraine's president, welcomed by the Belgian prime minister, Belgium, which wants guarantees if it's to release its 193 billion euros, mostly from Russia's central bank. Karis Garland has more.
Can the European Union reach an 11th hour compromise? With leaders deeply divided on whether and how to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine, the Polish Prime Minister says it comes down to a simple choice.
Either money today or blood tomorrow. And I am not talking about Ukraine only, I am talking about Europe. And this is our decision to make. and only ours.
In a bid to help plug looming holes in Ukraine's budget, the EU has come up with a complex scheme to use some 210 billion euros of Russian central bank assets to generate a reparations loan for Kiev. The bulk of these funds are in the Belgium-based financial clearinghouse Euroclear. The Belgian government is worried about the move's potential legal and financial risks. On Thursday, Prime Minister Bart de Wever reiterated 3 conditions he's asking of his European counterparts, including that assets held in other countries are also used and that the bloc, not Belgium alone, assume full financial responsibility for the risk.
I would say that the first 2 conditions are like a parachute. We need a parachute before we jump. The third condition is that if we are asked to jump, we all jump together.
Last week, Russia's central bank sued Euroclear, which is being interpreted as a warning shot. Speaking in Brussels, the Ukrainian president said he needed the EU to decide on the reparations loan by the end of the year.
Okay, let's go around the room here. Anastasia Shapachkina, seize the assets or not?
Well, the arguments, right, that the Belgian Prime Minister is putting forward, there are many, but there are financial arguments. If he yields to pressure, he has to close the gap in his budget. So it's absolutely unavoidable that it is not Belgium, although it's put on the spot, but it is all of
That's
Europe.
not solely legally liable.
Exactly. That is liable and that is able to close the gap somehow as well. However, there are other things. This rests accounting. This is rather clear, but there are other things which are more fears and more perceptions. And one of these is that other countries are going to see that Belgium and that the European Union is just taking anybody's assets whenever they want, and then nobody's going to ever invest in the European Union. Euro is going to grow weak. It's going to probably even default at some point because it's such a big risk. All of the Saudis are going to pull out their massive cash amounts, and then the European economy is going to collapse. But this, I think, is really a perception which is far from reality. Just this week, we saw Great Britain taking a decision to use the frozen assets from Roman Abramovich's Chelsea club case to give to Ukraine.
This is the Russian oligarch who had to sell Chelsea Football Club.
Exactly, after he found himself under sanctions, etc. And the result of this action is not that the entire world is pulling out their investment from Great Britain. And Great Britain hasn't thought of it as this is what's going to happen. But the precedent is exactly the same. The amounts are different, but the precedent is the same. And then I just want to take a mini case from a totally different area.
Of course, it's not the same order of magnitude of money we're talking about.
Different.
Chelsea and the Russian central bank is
but
not
the
the same.
money was the money.
It's 2.5 billion. It's not the small money either for
Exactly.
the UK.
And it's a precedent. It's a legal precedent.
Yeah.
You have a precedent there, and what happened? Nothing happened. Throughout the financial crisis, in developing countries, you had numerous examples, especially from 1997 Southeast Asia financial crisis, where numerous countries arrested foreign assets, barred foreign assets from exiting the country, defaulted on their debts, etc., etc. And what, 20, 10, 5 years later, you had the same investors re-entering the same markets with the same risks again and again and again. These premises are just false. And then let's look at a mini case in a totally different area. Let's take Turkey, and let's take the military jets. Every time a military jet or a drone happens to enter into the Turkish airspace without the Turkish permission, Turkey shoots it down, which could bring up the arguments like, wow, you shoot it down, nobody's ever going to enter your airspace ever again. This poses a risk to all of the commercial airspace. But no, happens to be these are Russian drones, these are Russian airplanes, and Turkey has never faced any consequence, continues to be a strategic partner of Russia, and everything was fine. Show the guts, and you're going to be respected. Show your weak spot, and you are just going to be beaten even more into submission.
Robert Peters, you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think this money should have been seized a while ago. I mean, the more we can impose costs on the Russian economy, the better it is to, defeat the Russian invasion. And I'll just say, this idea that the United States is now more of an ally to Moscow than it is of Europe, to me, is absurd. I mean, we stand ready with hundreds of nuclear weapons forward deployed in Europe, as well as ballistic missile submarines operating in the North Atlantic. We're willing to go to nuclear war in the defense of Europe against Russia. So this idea that we're not standing up as good partners and we're more pro-Moscow than we are pro-Europe, to me, is just frankly gross and weird.
Now, Robert, that's your position, but there are people inside of the Trump administration who've publicly pushed back against this idea of seizing the Russian assets.
That's right. That's in their administration. I don't speak for the administration.
Why is it, do you think?
Because I think Vladimir Putin's a war criminal. I think that the more Russians that are killed and the more Russian military capability that is destroyed, the less of a threat Russia is to NATO, which is what the United States really cares about.
But why isn't that the Trump administration's position?
You would have to ask the Trump administration that.
Eleanor Beardsley.
Well, it is very strange, like I say, to see this total 180-degree change in U.S. behavior. So everyone is still very destabilized by it and kind of doesn't know how to handle it. I agree. Just getting back to the frozen Russian assets. What Belgium is saying is fair. I mean, everyone should sign on to share that burden. I kind of agree with that. But secondly, being afraid that people would pull their money out of Belgium and not invest anymore. Well, because it would be unprecedented. Well, it's sort of unprecedented to invade your neighbor and send missiles into apartment blocks in cities for 4 straight years. So if you get your assets taken away for that, it's kind of, it's not for nothing. So I don't know. Everyone's still trying to figure it out, Francois. And yes, the U.S. seems to be actively working to get Europe not to use these assets as collateral for a loan. So who is exactly doing that? That's very strange. And that is giving some of the Europeans cold feet. And it's just very, very difficult to figure out how this is going to play out now with the administration, yes, weighing down, because even President Trump himself has accused Ukraine several times of starting the war. How is that?
All right, and there is another option, but Germany, the biggest nation in the bloc, refuses it, and that is some kind of a mutualization of debt, going to the bond market and creating some kind of euro bond for Ukraine. Why are they so dead set against this idea of sharing the burden on this?
Well, I don't know what is in the mind of Chancellor Merz, but I think there is the first option being so obvious, being the right one. I mean, we have these 220 billion assets frozen. We have an aggressor. It has been done before. I mean, people always talk there was no precedent. It has been done for Afghanistan and for Iraq, so it would not be the first time. But I think there's...
Iraq and Afghanistan don't have nuclear weapons.
Obviously, but it's not a question about the fear about nuclear retaliation. It's the fear that financial community may not invest in Europe. And I think I think the German position is to push towards the first option with all force. Let's not forget that the Germans didn't cave, but they realized in 2020, when there was the COVID-19 pandemic, they agreed to this 750 billion next generation Europe, and that was the first time mutualization of debt, which was normally a no-no for the Germans. So I think they're pushing for the first option, but I think the biggest disease that we see, remember how the vice president of the commission said, oh my goodness, we should not talk tough with the US because there might be retaliation. Well, when you enter a negotiation by fearing the opponent or the adversary or your trade partner, you have already lost. And I worry that every hour that passes by, the damage to European credibility of strengths, peace through strengths, as others would say, is eroding. We may actually lose on both fronts. We may at the end decide to unfreeze the assets and not have the credibility that comes with it. So I just hope our leaders will be up to
Of course, Moscow has leverage, and it's not just nuclear weapons. The Financial Times publishing a graph from the Kyiv School of Economics that has the 5 countries that have the biggest amount of assets that are still inside of Russia. These are companies that still do business one way or another. In the top 5, there's France. A counter-seizure can be easily arranged. Andrei Lizakuk-Petri, you talk about $2.5 billion, euros being a lot. How about, here, we're talking about 34 billion in the case of in all. And the United States is number 1 on the list, of course. But these are big sums. Is that weighing on the minds of Europeans?
I'm sure it is, and I think lobbying from all sides is going on, but I think we are in a situation. I think a lot of leaders, political but also economic leaders, have still not understood that we are out of this peaceful time that we lived in the last 70, 80 years. And I just want to quote, I was not a big fan of him in his beginning, but I thought that the speech of Secretary General Rutte last week in Berlin, where basically compared the situation with 1938, were very right, because that's exactly the situation in which we are. If tomorrow, like the Polish Prime Minister says, it's going to be with European blood and not with money that we're going to pay, that is going to cost us much more than the 11 billion assets that the French companies still have in Russia, or the 30x that was the French companies, and the 30 billion plus that the Germans have. I mean, this will be peanuts compared to the real cost to our societies, to our economy.
All right, so there could be maybe some kind of Brussels fudge, some in-between solution to get some money at least to Ukraine at an early stage. This summit's going to run, as we know. But is there movement when it comes to all of this? We saw, and Andre alluded to this meeting earlier this week, where you had Donald Trump's envoys, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, in Berlin with European leaders that included the likes of Giorgia Meloni, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer. The United States seems to be moving when it comes to its position regarding enforcing some kind of a neutral zone or something. I don't know how you would describe it. I know there are more talks planned between the Americans and the Russians. Is there any movement?
I think that the talks between the U.S. and the Europeans, who have now managed to get themselves, so to say, onto the table, as they wanted to be at the table of negotiations with America, is a result of basically Ukraine refusing the conditions, which were the 28 points, which were pretty much the copy-paste of the Russian ultimatum of December 2021 to Ukraine, and with a few more points. As a result of that stubbornness, the U.S. understood that it has to work on the European leaders who have more sway over Zelensky to then work on the Ukrainian leader. I think that another result, in addition to the Europeans getting themselves at the table, is also the fact that now the negotiations are also about the accession negotiations, the potential changing of rules, which is also something on the agenda right now in the Council. And it used to be that people would say...
Ukraine's accession to the European Union, you mean?
Anybody's accession, but of course they are thinking about Ukraine. Potentially, maybe this is part of their discussions, but between the U.S. and Europe. But it used to be that everybody was saying that it's so difficult to change the European treaties, and we have to start by changing the European treaties, which is impossible. And it's no longer the course of action we're seeing. Instead, we are seeing the course of action, look, we need to achieve this one goal, which is financial in nature. But for this, we need to neutralize certain countries. Hey, how about we just write a separate procedure, which is going to almost automatically change the treaty or influence the treaty or render it less powerful. And this is a major progress, because we no longer, the European Union understands, because as Andrea just said, that its own security is at stake.
So they're no longer beholden to Hungary, Slovakia, and now perhaps the Czech Republic.
It is no longer rational to hide themselves behind the fig leaf of Hungary and Slovakia and the Czech Republic or whatever, the Austria, whatever they want to pull out the next rabbit of the bag. Because behind this fig leaf, their own security is at stake. And today, Russia, which produces about 80,000 of Shahed, basically Shahed drones, which are 100-kilogram explosive each, per month, 80,000 per month, they have a capacity to reach and to bomb any country, small or big, including in the European Union, and then good luck meeting them with the air defense that we have.
We're looking ahead to those talks that might be taking place, in Miami? Robert Peters, let me ask you, we're a little exhausted here because it feels like there's something that's announced, then there's a lot of scrambling, then it's watered down, then it goes quiet, then another big thing is announced. Is this the way negotiations between the U.S. and Russia are just going to proceed along this cycle for the foreseeable future? Or is Donald Trump coming around to Europe's way of thinking?
I mean, I think that in many ways, this is a reflection of President Trump's negotiating style that's been with him for over 40 years now. That said, I mean, all indications are that he's increasingly growing frustrated with Mr. Putin and increasingly being stymied in his attempts to end this war, which he desperately wants to do, so that he can focus on other areas of priority for the president. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll get to some type of negotiated settlements in the coming months. But I mean, every president is different, and I think this is simply a reflection of his personality.
Eleanor Beardsley?
Well, these talks are going very well. And when I heard what Merz said, Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, that, you know, this joint security commitments, and it's like amazing. But all you have to do is know that Russia has never swayed one millimeter from its maximalist demands.
Yeah, we heard that clip of Putin at the beginning of the show.
Exactly, and so actually it becomes always clear in Ukraine. When you're in Ukraine, people aren't even watching these talks because there's one thing they know. Russia will not give anything. They will not give in. They want what they want. They have never swayed from it from the very beginning. And so they know that it won't work. They said you have to beat them. And so, yes, the talks are going well. And I just wonder, you know, when will President Trump actually get it that Putin is not going to give anything at all? And Zelensky knows this too, probably. So he's probably, you know, I'm listening to like some of the, you know, Ukrainians talk, and they're like, he knows it. He knows good and well, but he has to show he's ready to work. So when they know that it's Russia blocking this peace, when the Trump administration, when will they realize that it's Russia blocking this peace? Even Special Envoy Steve Witkoff seemed very pleased after all these talks with the Europeans. So you just wonder when the Trump administration is going to wake up and realize what's going on.
Andrzej Luzak-Petri?
Well, I wanted to insist on this economic dimension because on one side we talk about war and on the other side on frozen assets. I mean, what you just mentioned on air defense, let's realize that we have a conflict which is not just a military one, it's an economic conflict. When you have Shahed drones which cost $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, which need to be shot down right now by missiles that cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, you realize that today the risk is that this imbalance in attack versus defense is going to be won by economic means. So if we don't push forward today the economic capabilities of Ukraine, actually we are guaranteeing its defeat. So it's in our best interest that we solve that, because I think that is something that often we don't understand, is that today we have these asymmetry in costs which play particularly strongly.
Is it just window dressing and rhetoric when the Ukrainians talk up the fact that, look, we'll provide you with the drone technology so you can lower the costs on your air defenses? Is that just talk, or is there some kind of new ecosystem that involves Ukraine when it comes to defense?
Well, my very personal opinion is that what happens right now in Ukraine is that the companies that are building these drones, and just keep some figures in mind, 100,000 drones produced in 23, 1 million in 24, probably 5 million this year. It's a 50 times increase. We are seeing the future primes, I mean the big defense companies of Europe in 5 years may be actually the Ukrainian ones. I mean, today you don't see them because everything is used on the war effort, but once the peace will be there, and we hope in very good terms, these overcapacity, they will need to flow somewhere. And we had the story of overcapacity with China. So I think we need to first help Ukraine succeed and win. And secondly, it's in our best interest, when I take a European view, to partner with this emerging technology and defense ecosystem that is happening right. And probably we don't do enough on that.
And there is, again, this sense of urgency right now at this European summit. Support for Ukraine is still strong within Europe, but leaders realize that they're looking over their shoulders a bit. Nigel Farage's Reform Party topping polls in the UK, Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France, Alice Vidal's AFT in Germany. And there are signs of wider fatigue in European public opinion. News site Politico surveyed 10,000 people on the continent who then said, and they had said that many of them are towards dialing back Ukraine's support. Still a majority in favor, but they're talking about dialing it back to a degree. And you saw that picture there here in France. It was the call paid last week by the leader of the far-right National Rally and her number 2 to the U.S. ambassador. He happens to be the father of Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Ambassador Kushner gushed about all he learned from the pair you see in the photo. Jordan Bardella, who, by the way, raised eyebrows on a chat show last week during a segment where panelists had to say what they would ask to prominent figures.
If you had one question for Donald Trump,
where does he find all that energy?
It was, it surprised people because a majority, even of National Rally supporters, are not pro-Trump at this point.
No, they're not. We saw polls recently, 56% are not. They don't want to be a vassal state of the U.S. or some sort of colony. So they didn't really actually embrace what that new national security strategy was sort of saying. It's like, we don't need the U.S. to support us to win. But
do you feel, Eleanor, as though this support for Ukraine is beginning to falter a little in France and in Europe?
No, I think the war is going on a long time, but I hear more voices saying we've really got to step it up. This, this peace dividend of, since the end of World War II, the Europeans focused on their social welfare systems because the U.S. spent money on defense. And I hear a lot more Europeans saying, no, we have to be able to defend ourselves. Recently, I was out with some reserves, French reserves, people who volunteer on the weekends, and they were saying things like that. We have to be out there. We don't know what's, Russia is there now. We see what's happening. So no, I feel no, I don't. I feel yes. There's this, people are starting to realize this is going on a long time, but it's not going to get better by ignoring it. That's what I feel.
Antoine Petri?
I mean, there's a clear split in Europe.
Remember, there's a presidential election in this country in 2027. The front runner right now is either Marine Le Pen, if she can run. She's having legal problems, or the man you heard in that clip, her number 2.
Yeah. And what we heard since now 2 weeks is that in any scenario today, Bardella would win in the second round of elections. So, and that is also relatively new. I think regarding the support of the population, there's really a split. When you look at all the countries which are bordering Russia, the fear factor is maximum. Finland, Poland. I mean, we heard Tusk. Of course, the Baltic states, etc. The further you go, I think the French and the Germans have not yet risen to the fact. And I must say, some of our leaders are hard to understand. I mean, when you have the French army chief, Gérard Mandon, talking about the fact that we might actually have to make some sacrifices in our, I mean, he talks about our children. I think he meant, probably it was not, I mean, he meant obviously the soldiers being the children of the nation. We immediately had the president who said, yes, but for the new national service, I guarantee that the people, the reservists will not be employed outside of France. And if you water down a couple of minutes later because you're worried about the opinion polls, I mean, that's where you see real leaders and leadership. And I think what also a lot of the population realizes that since 2022, we have always done a little bit too late, too little. I mean, we did not go in with the full defense systems. The Germans, still up to today, don't want to provide the long-range missiles, the famous Taurus, despite the fact that Merz promised it in his election campaign 10 months ago. I mean, the population sees that. So they see the hesitation of their leaders, so you probably cannot expect from the population that they're very decisive.
So, Robert Peters, Paris is further away from Lviv and Kyiv than Warsaw. Washington's a lot further away. Let me ask you, when you hear, we talked earlier in the conversation about that allusion by the NATO Secretary General to 1938, when there was a meeting to appease the Nazis when they invaded the Sudetenland. Is that comparison viable? A belligerent Russia, an America that's more isolationist, and a Europe that doesn't want to fight?
No, I think that's a very valid comparison. I mean, I actually do think that the security situation in which we find ourselves is very akin to 1937 or 1938. I think we're seeing the autocrats in Asia and in Eastern Europe trying to overthrow the world's liberal democracies. And fundamentally, we need to be prepared for high-intensity, protracted warfare against China and Russia and their lesser proxies in North Korea and Iran. And I think it's not being wildly speculative to say that that war could come within 5 years. And so Europe should do all that it can to rearm right now and create credible combat capability forward deployed to deter necessary defeat Russian aggression. With support by the United States, while at the same time we focus our primary effort on deterring, if necessary, defeating Chinese aggression. It simply comes down to who's going to cover down on what theaters using what types of military capabilities. And I think we can do it. I just think we need to be all rowing in the same direction.
Anastasia Shapachkina, you agree?
I could not have agreed more, and I wish we were all rowing in the same direction. My fear is that this is not the perception the Europeans have anymore of America, unfortunately, that we are rowing in the same direction. And we wish, and even the French, who've always historically been outspokenly anti-American, they have really regretted the turn of the last year, which is their wildest dreams finally coming true in a nightmare scenario. And this is really a problem. Now, I want to just come to this, to what was said about the flank. Like, yes, Europe must absolutely strengthen its flank. It is growing in the realization, even among staunch American allies like Poland, Germany, Sweden, that it has to stand more on its own, has to be prepared to stand its own. And in that realization, the first front line of the defense of Europe is Ukraine. And the biggest barrier that we are now, I think observing in Brussels is the denial of that. It's just that against all facts, the denial continues, because we can have 5 years if we were deciding when to start the war. But the rabbit has never decided when the hunter was going to shoot the bullet. And we may just not have the 5 years.
Let me ask you about this, because the U.S. this week saying they're perfectly happy with Ukraine joining the European Union. Jordan Bardella, we played that clip of the #2 of the National Rally. He's against, but not because of Ukraine, of the war with Russia. He's against because he's afraid, and there were the farmers protesting because of cheap agricultural goods would flood the market, as he says. So do you see that happening anytime soon, Ukraine joining the European Union?
From the conversations that I've had, I think that unfortunately is not very close, is not on the cards, but we may be surprised. Let us be surprised. I think that the priority from what we hear as it's perceived by the Europeans and the Ukrainians is defense, to strengthen the defense. And the biggest barrier there is to understand that Ukraine is an integral part of the European defense and not some younger brother who is limping on 2 legs. No, it is actually the wall of defense.
Very briefly, because we're out of time.
I just want to say, it's the moment of truth where the EU can show its strategic power. And I think we also need to be honest. The fact that it has been promised, and I know that might be discomforting, to join the EU is just not realistic compared to our population. But it does not, we should be a little bit smarter than just think it's either inside or outside. The Article 42, which is the equivalent more or less of Article 5 of the European Treaty, could be maybe applied to Ukraine in a particular way without having necessarily Ukrainian farm goods enter the EU. So we need to be strategic here.
So the need for creative thinking when it comes to financing and when it comes to defense. Andrei Lozikog-Petri, I want to thank you. I want to thank Eleanor Beardsley, Anastasia Shapachkina, Robert Peters for being with us from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.